All right, good morning, everyone. I would like to introduce the next point on the program. So dear experts, dear project partners, dear workshop participants and guests, let me introduce to you and welcome Professor Liviu Matei, who has, despite his very busy schedule, agreed to speak to us today on the responsibilities of higher education institutions in the education for democratic citizenship and human rights. Professor Matei is Provost and Pro-Rector of Central European University, and he has also been, in the past 25 years, acting as advisor and consultant in the area of higher education policy for numerous international organizations such as the World Bank, UNESCO, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the European Commission. So basically all organizations that exist in the world and have activities in the area of higher education. He has also worked on several applied policy research projects in the area of higher education and transformation in different countries in Europe and Asia, such as in Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Myanmar, Moldova, and Romania. But despite all of these activities, he has always found time to be and to remain an educator and a mentor for students here at CEU. So he is a professor of higher education policy at the School of Public Policy, and also he has extensively published in the past years on the challenges and transformations of higher education as relating to university governance, funding, internationalization, and other issues. So without going any further, I would like to ask you to welcome Professor Matei, and I will give him the floor now. And after his speech, we will have some time for questions and discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Adrienn. This is really kind of you. I would also like to welcome all of you to this seminar on citizenship and human rights education. I'd like to welcome representatives of NGOs, international organizations. I understand that the Council of Europe and OSCE are represented here. I would like to welcome students from wherever they come, including high school students, and I would like to welcome in particular secondary school teachers. It is very rare that we have teachers on our campus, and we tend to forget how important their work is. When I first got this invitation to talk about the responsibilities of the universities in citizenship and human rights education, I hesitated a little bit. I hesitated because I am no expert in human rights, as my colleagues who are from CEU well know. And also I'm not really an expert in human rights education. But I didn't hesitate a lot, and I accepted with very much pleasure. For two reasons. First, I can't say no to an invitation to attend a student event. I cannot say no to something that students are organizing and it's good and important. And the second reason is that although I am not an expert in human rights, in my own research and advising, I have grown increasingly preoccupied by human rights aspects. And my own area is higher education policy, as Adrienn mentioned. And also I am a university administrator, and we university administrators have a responsibility for citizenship education and human rights education. Now, because these two areas are quite vast, citizenship education and human rights education, I noted in your draft memorandum that you use slashes for that. I mean, if I can go back to my basic job, that was that of a professor, and I can make a suggestion: don't use slash. It's very confusing to say human rights education, citizenship / something else. But I'm going to get rid of these slashes myself by focusing only on human rights rather than both human rights and citizenship education in my talk today. Now I am going to speak about two aspects of human rights in higher education, and in particular when it comes to the responsibilities of higher education. The first area is, or aspect, is from higher education policy itself, and I would state that there is a tendency to neglect human rights, not only when it comes to education, which is what universities do, but also in the organization and operations of the universities. I'll explain that a little bit. And I would also say this phenomenon is not sufficiently researched, and it manifests in surprising ways with negative impacts. So, to make it a little bit simple, we don't quite talk about rights, human rights in higher education policy when it comes to discussing about the mission of the university, the organization of the university, or the operations of the university. As I promise that I will talk about that and give some examples. The second aspect that I'm going to touch upon is based on CEU's experience in human rights education, because this is what I believe I know. I will discuss a little bit about how universities could and should engage in human rights education, and I would also want to warn you that, perhaps warn myself, this is not completely straightforward either. So how universities in general should fulfill their responsibility to human rights education, and I will talk about gaps, challenges, dilemmas, including here at CEU, but also perhaps about some good, interesting, positive experiences in this area. So the first aspect about the higher education part. Well, I said it already, the dominant discourse in higher education policy in Europe tends to neglect, ignore, or disregard issues of values, of human rights, and tends to concentrate on instrumental aspects. I would say sometimes on instrumental aspects only. But let me put this in a broader context and perhaps point to something that may appear as a paradox. We now live and work in the European higher education area. This is a remarkable, unprecedented development. We have 48 countries working more or less together, sometimes really working together, including Kazakhstan and Ireland, Cyprus and Finland, Romania and Germany, you name it. So this is not only as a common space for policy dialogue, but also as a common space for action, work in higher education. It is quite unprecedented, and there are some worthy common objectives here, like mobility, social dimension, quality assurance. I don't think that anybody would argue against that, and there is some real progress and advancement in this area. One of the most interesting developments in the European higher education area, which started with the Bologna process in 1999, was officially declared a reality in 2010. One of the most important developments is increased freedom. But freedom, we can ask, freedom for who? Well, some people would say certainly freedom for institutions. Higher education institutions, universities, colleges, other higher education institutions have a lot more freedom from their national governments, from the states, than it was before. Because before the European higher education area, the relationship was individually university government, university minister of education. Now, because we have a European space, there is a lot more freedom. A German university can go for accreditation in Cyprus. A Hungarian university can go for accreditation in Germany, and this is happening as a matter of fact. And the accreditation is done according not to national standards, but to European, commonly agreed upon standards. So there is some freedom for institutions. Universities can apply, or academics can apply for funding from the European Union when there is no funding available nationally for research. So there is something about increased freedom. We can also say there is increased freedom for students. Students have the choice to go to other countries. They have to some degree the choice regarding their own curriculum as part of the ECTS system. Academics also have increased freedom when it comes to mobility. For sure, they can go to other countries. Now, the European Commission is trying hard now to create a European pension fund for researchers, so that the academics, researchers can take their pension savings with them from one country to another, and this speaks for the attempt to give them more freedom. So we can talk about increased freedom in terms of freedom from the state, mainly for the institution rather for the university, and this is what we call usually institutional autonomy or university autonomy. I should also say that as part of because of the Bologna process, but also because of the European initiatives, policy frameworks like the Lisbon Agenda and Europe 2020, higher education became very prominent on the public agenda, including on the political agenda in Europe. And some people say higher education has become central to the European experience. And what is meant by that? Well, you might know the objectives of the Lisbon strategy of the European Union, launched in 2000, replaced by Europe 2020 in 2010. So one of the objectives were to build the most advanced economy in the world, in Europe, with social cohesion, full employment, and more choices for the men and women of Europe. Sounds like the paradise, and I don't want to caricaturize it, but this was the actual objective. How was this all supposed to be realized? By building a knowledge society in Europe. A knowledge society means knowledge. Which are the institutions that can produce knowledge, help to transmit knowledge, disseminate and use? Universities play a central role in that. So if Europe placed a bet on the knowledge society, Europe had to place a bet on higher education as well, and to a good degree this has actually happened. This is what I mean when I say higher education became central to the European experience in this year. So here's the paradox. If these are all good developments, more freedom and more centrality for higher education, why am I saying that rights are neglected, human rights, freedoms are neglected in the policy discourse and policy initiatives, policy frameworks in the European higher education? And I'm going to give some examples about that. I promise it for the third time now. I really have to do it. I should just take one step back and say, what is very important for higher education, although we might not feel it directly when we are inside the university as students, administrators, or academics. It's what is called the Higher Education Compact. This is like a social contract for the purpose of higher education, an unwritten contract, agreement involving governments, the European Union, the industry, parents, higher education institutions themselves. So there is a kind of common understanding, for example, with regard to the mission of higher education. What are universities for? And these compacts are changing from time to time, as we can see in different countries. But I would say the dominant understanding at present regarding the purpose of higher education as part of the current higher education compact is instrumental, fundamentally, and I would say it tends to be exclusive. And let me illustrate. What do I mean? And I'll read out. Perhaps the only time I'm going to read from a document. This is a document from the European Commission, and it says something like this: while the public mission and the overall societal and cultural remit of the European universities must be preserved, they should increasingly become significant players in the economy, able to respond better and faster to the demands of the market, able to develop partnerships and harness scientific and technological change. I'm not going to read it again, but just say public mission, overall societal and cultural remits of the university are mentioned, which is good. But the focus is on universities as players in the economy. And this is what I speak. So that means knowledge for industry, skills for people to get a job. So this is what I mean by the instrumental focus as part of this discourse. So what is it that we ignore then when I say rights aspects are ignored? Well, there is very little, and only occasionally, that there is talk as part of this policy discourse about the right to education. we do talk about access, which is reflecting a concern for the right to education, but the right to education is more complex than just access. We talk very rarely about the right to pursue research and teaching and learning, both for academics and for students, and this is what we call traditionally academic freedom. And I'll say more about that. Or, we talk also very little about related rights and freedoms in universities, like the freedom of association or freedom of speech. And when there are developments in a society, and I don't need to name any country, that in terms of regulatory frameworks for these freedoms, restriction on these freedoms, they also affect higher education. Let me now really give some examples. What do I mean by the fact that we tend to forget about right? We also tend to forget about values and other issues than just these instrumental issues. The European Union advocates that European universities should have more money. Funding should be increased for higher education, because this is how we can be competitive with other universities. Funding per student in Europe is a lot lower than funding per student in the United States, for example. But how should funding be increased? Primarily with contributions from the industry, and mainly through fees, student fees, right? Students paying for their own education. And there is something to it. I would say this university, we are committed at CEU to provide financial aid to as many students as we can. All our students receive full stipends for us. They can study. They have funding from CEU for 4 years. Basically, most of our master students also receive funding from the university. Although we are a private university, we rarely charge tuition fees, but we cannot afford to give to all students. And if we want, now we are thinking, frankly, ourselves, how to increase financial aid, perhaps by, not financial aid, that will not decrease, but how to increase revenues from students, perhaps asking students, some of them, can you pay? And if you can pay, fine, pay. But what I want to say is that the trend in Europe is, so the discussion is, yes, funding should remain fundamentally public responsibility. The ministers of the Bologna countries have declared this only once in a document, and they have declared it because the European Student Union insisted. So officially, funding is considered to be public responsibility, but the actual trends, policies are towards increased contributions from students. Look at what is happening in Spain. Now look at what happened in Germany. There was an attempt to introduce tuition fees. It was, rescinded. Perhaps it will come back. Look at what is happening in Hungary. Look at what is happening in other countries. So what has this to do with rights, and even with human rights regulation? There is one document that we have forgotten about at all in Europe in higher education. Now, people in human rights will know it for sure. The Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of 1966, which many countries, basically all countries in Europe, committed to observe, although perhaps with some exceptions and in different ways. And there are provisions about education and higher education. I'm going to read just 2 paragraphs. The states parties to this covenant recognize the right of everyone to education. The state parties to the present covenant recognize that with a view to achieving the full realization of this right, 1. Primary education should be compulsory and available free to all. Fine. 2. Secondary education in its different form, including technical and vocational secondary education, shall be made generally available and accessible to all by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. And these 3, now comes 3, higher education. Higher education shall be made equally accessible to all on the basis of capacity, by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. So there is this important international document talking about the progressive introduction of free education in higher education. Is this happening? No, the contrary is happening. And what is even more interesting, we never talk about it. So if I mention this covenant in a conference, people will look at me, what am I talking about? No, this is not part of the dominant narrative at present. And as I said, I understand it. There is pressure on public finances, individual university finances, but it also means that we have forgotten about this, and it is not only forgetting about the document, it is forgetting or neglecting something that has to do with the right to education, the right to higher education. I'll give you another example, and this is a little more complex even. I'll try to make it simple. Not only that universities should care about the rights of students, for example, or they should teach rights, human rights, but they should care about rights and freedoms inside the universities themselves. And this has to do with institutional autonomy, which I mentioned briefly, but also with academic freedom. Universities cannot operate unless they have these two types of freedoms. Now, if I want to be very provocative and without too much introduction and explanation, I would quote a sentence that I learned from one of my students who is studying academic freedom in Russia, and she is not the author of this sentence, but she told me about it. And this sentence says, academic freedom is the price that the society should pay for the production of knowledge. Academic freedom is the price that the society should pay for the production of knowledge. What the hell on earth is, or what the earth is that? So now, the point that I'm trying to make is that we tend to forget about conditions for the work of universities, which have to do with particular freedoms, which have to be reflected in the mode of organization of the university. And that is the freedom of the university within certain limits, and the freedom of individual academics and students also within certain limits. And I'm going to quote two illustrations of what I'm saying now. One quote is from the most reputable report on the one of the most reputable reports on academic freedom, the so-called Calvin Committee report on the university's role in political and social action, issued at the University of Chicago in 1967, and it says, to perform its mission in the society, a university must sustain an extraordinary environment of freedom of inquiry and maintain an independence from political passions, and pressures. The university is not a club, is not a trade association, is not a lobby. So here the emphasis is on the freedom from politics, but it's not only about the freedom from politics, and we don't need to go to the US to find such expressions and people who have thought about it. I wanted to quote another statement made by a Hungarian academic who eventually went to Germany and then to the United States. He's the one who discovered vitamin C, Albert Saint-Dieu, who wrote, a university should be pervaded by the love of truths, and among its walls should safeguard an air of intellectual freedom without which all cultures wither away. Intellectual freedom within the walls of the university. We tend to forget about that in Europe, both outside the universities, in the political policy circles, and inside the universities. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a feeling that university autonomy has actually increased in Europe. Well, this is a lot more complicated than that, because university autonomy is not a unidimensional concept. There are different dimensions of autonomy. There is academic autonomy, there is financial autonomy, or its options, there is staffing autonomy, and so on. And what is happening is that we have extreme cases of restriction of university autonomy, or very insidious cases. And I'll give examples of both. Take some extreme cases. When the Hungarian government adopts a law which would result in closing down a university like us, that is an attack not on academic freedom, but on university autonomy. The government didn't tell us you cannot study this subject or you cannot teach this subject, but they told us you cannot operate the way you want to operate. So that is against the freedom of the university to organize itself as it finds fits, of course, within the limit of the law. What is happening in Turkey has happened last year in particular, was an attack on both academic freedom and university autonomy. Academics and students have been sent to jail. Universities have been closed down. Individual academics have been fired because of their opinions. So these are extreme cases. But sometimes, as I said, we can talk about what I would call insidious cases. Take Holland, you know, a democratic country with a lot of autonomy for the university. Universities can decide to organize themselves inside as they wish. There's no interference. But universities are funded, at least in part, to what is called performance agreement. They agree with the government what they are going to do in the next 5 years. And the government is giving them money or part of the funding for that. So universities are free to decide how they achieve those objectives, but not what the objectives are, as a matter of fact. So they have managerial autonomy, but they don't have strategic autonomy. And you might say, why is that important? I'll give you another example, which is perhaps even more extreme and therefore more clear, you know, like a clinical example. Take China. Chinese universities, at least some of them, have a lot of autonomy in financial matters, for example. Have autonomy in other areas as well. They lack strategic autonomy, so they cannot decide what are they about, what they are going to do, and then the government will decide from outside, and then every 4 or 5 years, this strategy will change. The government will come and say, no, you don't do this, you do this, without universities having any role in this decision. And sometimes, at one point, someone asked me, well, why is it bad, actually? What is bad with it? And I tried this sloppy metaphor. Imagine that someone is giving you a car, the most powerful Mercedes that exists, money for gas. You can go on the highway as fast as you can, but you can only go up and down the same highway. You don't decide where you go, if you go out, if you look at other paths. And this is why Chinese universities, they are very productive at present. They publish, Chinese academics publish more than American academics, but in terms of new concepts, new knowledge, new products, they are far behind the United States. They lack creativity because they don't have the autonomy to search for it. So this is a little bit about university autonomy. Let me say a few words about academic freedom. Now, I discussed this recently at a conference in Bucharest, and when I said that there is very significant disregard for academic freedom in Europe, and that is bad, I got almost lynched by some of the participants, one of the participants, who said, what are you talking about? There is no problem with academic freedom in Europe. University autonomy perhaps here and there, but academic freedom, we have all the academic freedom that we want, and we don't need more because that would be ivory tower. You want academics to benefit from some particular type of freedom that other people in the society or in other sectors don't have. And then I thought of this example. So we don't have anywhere in Europe the principles, concept of academic freedom codified. There are provisions in constitutions, there are provisions in some higher educational law, but they are usually scant, sometimes indirect, generic, general. In the United States, the American Association of University Professors issued, I think it was already 1927, a statement on what academic freedom is, which serves as a reference until today. We don't have that in Europe, and we have no institution that is dedicated to the protection of academic freedom. Sometimes, although rarely, court will take up issues of academic freedom, I should say. But let me give you examples to prove that academic freedom is in danger and is restricted. Imagine this country in a capital, or this university in a capital of a European higher education area country, where the rector says, nobody in my university can teach gender studies subjects. Not that there can be no gender studies program, that didn't exist anyway, but if anybody teaches gender studies something in a history course or in a political science course, that person will be fired, and eventually they were fired. And this is now a real case. What is that if not an infringement on academic freedom? The right of the professors to decide what they teach, how they teach, and also on the academic freedom of the students who cannot study that. Or, just to come back for a moment to this country, the academic freedom is restricted already in the constitution. And it is mentioned that academic freedom of the Hungarian Academy is protected only, and that no researcher in Hungary from a university or research institute can do any kind of research that would offend national pride in Hungary. So that is also, you cannot do a research in history that might go against the prevailing narrative with regard to the ethnogenesis of the Hungarian people. So that is an infringement of academic freedom. And I can mention other examples also from Western countries, when the dean, for example, is telling faculty members of his or her school, you cannot study this, you cannot teach this because I decide. And it is happening, so it is not a made-up case. So we have, my conclusions to this part is, I'm going back where I started. Universities and policymakers tend to expect higher education to focus on instrumental aspects, skills, knowledge for use, and they also tend to disregard rights and freedoms in the university, inside the university themselves, which in turn impact negatively their capacity to fulfill their mission and to serve the citizens and the society. I should also say that I'm not against the instrumental focus. That is important, but if it is only that and we neglect the other parts, values and rights, there will be a problem. Now, second part of my talk, I still have some time, right? A little bit. Then I'll go fast here. It's about what the university can do based on our own experience here at CEU when it comes to human rights education. I think we are doing 6 things, and my colleagues will complete or correct me if I'm wrong on it. Preparing human rights specialists, teaching human rights for all our students, at least we want to do that. We do research, education, and training through research in human rights, student-led activities, which are important for human rights education. We also have educational initiatives and action that reflect a commitment to human rights and human rights education, although they don't involve human rights education, but they do make a contribution, and then outreach. In terms of training, we are a graduate university, as you know, with only master and PhD programs in social sciences and humanities, basically. We have programs in human rights, an LLM in human rights, and an MA in human rights. The LLM, you probably are familiar with the concept, most of you, presupposes that students come with the first degree in law already. And then they do this program in human rights, they get a specialized Master of Law in human rights. But we also have a Master of Law, Master of Arts in human rights. Students without a law background, they haven't studied law at all, and then they will not become lawyers and attorneys and judges. They do the same program, but they'll have different careers. So on the one side, we prepare people who will be professionals, legal professionals in human rights. The others will be also professional in human rights, but they will not work with courts and tribunals and legal capacity, but in the public administration, in NGOs, in international organizations. That is a very important contribution that we are trying to make. We also have a PhD doctoral program in legal studies with 2 tracks, constitutional law and international business law. And as far as I know, both students enrolled in both tracks get exposure to human rights, not only those in constitutional law, where obviously it is mandatory. And I think it's also interesting, we have a human rights specialization between our legal studies department and political science. If I remember well, philosophy is also there, which is a very interesting approach, trying to broaden the intellectual and professional horizon of the students beyond the legal profession. The second endeavor is about teaching human rights to other students. And I should say here, I'm aware human rights education starts from primary school, and there's also an obligation for secondary schools and so on. Universities do it with different means, and we are a particular type of university because we are a graduate university only, specializing in social sciences and humanities. We are thinking at present to make it possible for all our students to get some kind of exposure to human rights education. Our rector is dreaming of a university-wide course in the rule of law, for example, which all students at CEU should take. We have ethics and legal courses for professional programs like public policy, business, sociology. I doubt that there is any particular master program at CEU where there is some element of human rights education. I would also like to mention briefly one of the recent initiatives, which is both teaching and research. The project is called Just Data. And this is a project by colleagues from various departments, studying aspects of big data, technical aspects, but also ethical and legal access, like data protection, for example, who has access to data and who doesn't, and also trying to teach students both technical aspects, including coding, for example, computer coding, but also social aspects, ethical aspects. So that's the title of the project. I thought it was very inspired, Just Data. And I would put a question mark after it. Is it just data? Is data just or fair? Is it just data? Is it only data? Or is it more than that? So in research, all our students in these programs that I mentioned have to do some kind of research, and they do this by way of trying to learn what is happening on the ground in the area of human rights, but also in order to learn how to communicate with others, with other academics, with professional organizations, with international organizations. So we are doing training in human rights by research, not only by teaching. Student-led activities, I'll just mention two sentences here. I'm very proud we have at CEU or an organization which is called Human Rights Student Initiative. So this is a group of students and former students doing awareness raising, training, and other outreach activities here. This is student-led, but it's funded entirely by the university. And why is it important to have student-led activities? Because students can see things that we don't see in the administration of the university or as academics. They complement, supplement what the university does or it doesn't. And I'll give you one example which is haunting me as a parent. One of my daughters studied biomedical sciences in one of the best universities in the UK. For 3 years at the undergraduate level, there was no other course than strictly biomedical. No sociology, no history, no human rights, no nothing. I was and I remain furious about that. She learned, she's very good in biomedical sciences, and she suffered of this, from this as well. She had a chance through activities organized by the student union in that university to work with kids with special needs, for example. And that was her only chance to learn about aspects that are other than professional, and it was very good. So this is an example of student-led activities that supplement or complement what the university does or doesn't. The last example, I'll keep the very last one, is about educational activities that universities do, can do, must do, which are not directly about human rights education. And I'll mention our own example here. It's also a project that I'm very proud of. We have special programs for Roma students. And remember, we are a graduate university, so we have programs to help Roma students to do master's and PhD programs. Some people think we are crazy doing that. Why are we even trying to let Roma students to do PhDs when there is so much at stake with illiteracy, for example? Some Roma kids cannot go to school at all, or they don't graduate from primary school. Why are we spending money on PhDs for Roma? And our approach has been, this is very important. It is an issue of rights in a way, because nowadays, if you want to be a participant in the public arena, if you want to speak up and be listened, speak up on your community, for example, you need a master's degree, at least. You cannot become a journalist, you cannot become a scientist, you cannot become a member of the parliament. They are buying PhDs, but that's something different, unless you have a graduate degree. So Roma cannot be represented as Roma in the public arena unless they have graduate degrees. And we know not every Roma needs a graduate degree, or it is possible to give them a graduate degree. But this is a matter of self-determination and self-representation, and it works like that. We have contributed to the generation of a Roma intelligentsia in Europe, which is already active. We have done this program for over 15 years. But there is also something else that is happening. Our students, non-Roma students, work and live with Roma students. on the campus and in the classroom, and that has an immense positive impact on them. They learn about the issues of their Roma colleagues. They see how you can do human rights education. They think completely differently than they would have done otherwise. So this is an example of what I call, action, which is not necessarily about, or not directly about teaching human rights, but it contributes a lot to human rights education. I think I'll end here just by saying, it is possible and important for universities to engage in human rights education. It is also possible and important that universities engage with other partners and learn from other partners. And I would be very interested to learn from your discussions and conclusions here. I read through the draft report or memorandum that you have prepared. I was very surprised because it resonates a lot with what I was trying to say. Well, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Matei, for this very rich yet very practical and palpable approach to different aspects of human rights and rights in universities. And I'm now going to open the floor. We still have a few minutes for a few questions. So please, if there's anyone who would like to ask a question. Or
yes, I mean, I really like what you presented, and as a graduate of this institution, I can say, well, yes, that's how it is. But then the question is that, for me, as a graduate of the history department, where you have like historians, and they like to sit in the archive all day, and they don't really care about rule of law and democracy and human rights. I mean, they didn't care until like their employer got attacked. So my question would be, how do you interest medievalists in this issue, and how can you, because this university-wide seminar, some professors, they were quite suspicious because they were like, oh, how can we reconcile it with our history curriculum, because they really want to train the best historians and not human rights activists.
Yeah. Well, that is a good question, and it points to some of the difficulties that I was alluding to at the beginning. And let me just add, how do you say, injury to offense, or the other way around. We had a discussion at some point about this in the board of trustees of the university, which is a very prestigious body with, I don't know, the former president of Stanford, the Provost of Chicago, and the Vice Chancellor of Oxford nowadays. And everybody said, very good idea. We need university-wide courses, and rule of law, human rights, you have to do it for everybody. Then another trustee said, oh, but there are issues of sustainability, environmental things. Everybody should do that. Someone else said, but what about epistemology? We are a graduate university. Everybody needs to know about knowledge and all this. So they ended up with 12 proposals like that. And I raised my hand and I said, you realize that if we do all these courses, there is no master in anything else but general education master. And actually, we are thinking perhaps we should do a general education master, and some students should have the choice not to do a master in history, but it's a kind of new general education degree. But that might not be the solution. So we are thinking, and we will probably take a year more to think how to do this, because we do want CU graduates, master graduates, for example, to know certain things, including about human rights. How are we going to do that? It's not decided upon at present. We have some initiatives that I mentioned, so you probably learn a lot more about human rights from Hershey activities. They are doing a campaign on campus right now, awareness raising regarding violence against women. I don't know how many courses you had in history, but you are right. Professors are concerned about their disciplines, about the professional careers of their students, which makes a lot of sense. So this is one of the illustrations of what I was trying to talk about. We, policymakers and academics, tend to forget about human rights and this. So it is a job for the university administrator to make this happen in the university. How? It's a longer discussion, and I don't think I have the full answer.
Anyone else? Yes, there is.
I will start with a small comment on what you have said, on what Constanze has said. I have followed also the history DA at the Babes-Bolyai University in Cluj, and I had the great opportunity to have a seminar professor who had followed the master's degree at CEU, the Medieval History Masters, and the experience itself, the teaching experience, improved a lot my awareness of human rights and that of my colleagues, because the style of the teaching was totally different in a positive way of what we had been used to previously. She put us to debate, to discuss our arguments, to find out our ideas and not to learn by heart. So even the influence of her having been here for a few years with her master's was tremendous for us.
Glad to hear that. And I will say nothing about medieval studies special.
That was the turning point in my life when I decided not to apply for that master's and to continue with contemporary history, but let's not get into it. Okay. I really had prepared the information needed for the file. My question was regarding the master's in Roma history and Roma rights. Whether there are spaces in curricula related to the history of the US people of African origin and the way that they have built up their human rights.
Well, thank you for the question. I didn't have the time to talk too much about it. We don't have a master program in Roma anything. So we have a preparatory program for Roma students who have a university degree, and over a year we help them learn English and also advance their knowledge of the discipline so they can apply successfully to graduate schools either at CEU or somewhere else. But when they apply for the regular MA in political science, in philosophy, so we don't want to put them or to force them to study Roma studies. They study what everybody else studies. As part of the preparatory program, however, we do have courses on Roma identity, for example. And this is also not easy. Roma language. I insisted that our students, Roma students, be taught Romani language. And this is very difficult because there is no one Romani official language. Some students didn't want it. Some of our supporters told that, and some colleagues at CEU told that this is in forced identity training, which we should not do. But we are doing it nevertheless. And now, when you talk about comparing with the experience of the civil rights movement in the US, we are doing that a lot. We are doing that for the case of with our Roma students and professors, but also with everybody else. We had a big conference just on that, and by now we almost repeat it every year, bringing people from the US as well, who are either activists or scholars. And I like to joke. We have our previous rector was American. He was white, a WASP, and he was accused jokingly of being a white male American, and my answer to that was, actually, this is not true. He is black. What do I mean by that? He is black because in a way he contributed to making CEU relevant to the cause of building Roma intelligentsia the same way that American historical black colleges did in the US. So it was not possible for a long time for black students to go to regular universities, so they created this what is now called historically black colleges, and they created the intelligentsia, black intelligentsia, the leaders of the liberation movement, and we have done something similar in Europe. So I like to think sometimes that CEU as a historically black university.
There was one question over there, yes?
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. You were talking about the autonomy of universities and about the dominant discourse, for instance, in the European Commission. And we have seen the possibilities, for instance, fighting a government in the case of CEU. How do you see the possibilities of fighting industry and big capital in terms of how capitalist economy influences universities or puts high pressures on it?
Well, that is again a very broad topic, and I know a few things about that. So, now, there are countries, for example, where higher education policy is made by the Chamber of Commerce. And we have something like that here in this country, where the Chamber of Commerce would tell the government what to do in higher education, and they do. Or we have countries, Portugal, where new curricula must be approved by representatives of the employers, which is the business sector. Is there justification to that? Perhaps to some extent. So discussing, doing things together, but having this decision, I think that's very, very scary. Now, even when the Bologna process was started, the lament was that this was started by 3 big transatlantic companies, IBM, Coca-Cola, and Xerox. And it has never been proven. That belongs to the rumors and fake something, even it was said before the fake news phrase was coined. But so there is something to that, and how universities can fight. You can fight individually. You can fight together with others. One should be aware about that. It is a lot of the responsibility is on the university leadership. But there is, I would say, when it comes to university autonomy, and I said this earlier, the key is in the hands of the state. It is the responsibility of the state, and also the state has the possibility to turn the key off or on. I know it's an old Humboldtian idea, but I believe in it. The state must protect universities because universities produce public good, and public good that is needed in the society. I thought you were alluding to something else which is very important, and that's the role of solidarity. And we have seen CEU would be nowhere without the wave of solidarity expressed by institutions, individuals in Hungary, in Europe, United States, everywhere in the world. That worked, that contributed a lot. It didn't work in the case of Turkey, right? Interesting. We can discuss why, but what I'm saying is solidarity, international solidarity is important. I am advocating currently for the creation of a European Observatory on Academic Freedom, for example. But also individual universities have an obligation to express solidarity with academics or institutions that are in danger. We have done this through the times, and I can give you an example. When Milosevic adopted the higher education law, you might remember that in Serbia, and the deans were fired, all of them, from one day to another, similar to what happened in Turkey. The European University Association decided that all European universities should cut their cooperation with Serbian universities, because that would only play in the hands of the regime. We at this university refused to do that, and instead offered to Serbian academics to come here. Many of them came, some of them went back once Milosevic was gone, some of them even remained. So that was something similar in Belarus. When regulations changed and PhD studies in social sciences were affected, we invited PhD students from Belarus to come and finish their studies here at CEU. We are taking, we took only one academic from Turkey, for example, hired one after she was fired. We have a current CEU student arrested in Turkey, and we also tried to do something. She was released by now, not sure whether because of our intervention or else, but what I'm saying, there is an obligation of solidarity among institutions and academics when it comes to both autonomy and academic freedom.
Thank you. Is there any other? Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for your remarks. I know we are in time, but I would still use this opportunity to ask whether you have any recommendation how to push for change inside universities, and especially now I'm having in mind large public universities where university elites, rather than any state elites, for instance, can sometimes be hostile towards ideas such as a university-wide course on human rights, or some student body which would be funded by the university and would be able to provide some activities for students in this.
Yeah, but theoretically there are many ways, and students can play a role. And this is also one of the most remarkable things in European higher education, is that students are always at the table when policy decisions are made, whether it is at the department level, faculty level, university level, or European level, national level or European level. And we have seen, I mentioned earlier, European Student Union forced the minister to adopt this principle about public responsibility for funding. You can do something similar, or you can try at least, at university level. There is, there are some, something that professional associations can try and can do, national associations or international association. By this I mean, I don't know, the associations of architects or doctors or other things. I don't have a recipe. I do have ideas, and if you hire me as a consultant, I'll do it for free for you in that institution. But it depends on special circumstances. My point here is that we forget to talk about it. We forget to talk about rights, whether it is the rights that are needed for the university community or the rights that the university should teach or do research about.
Okay, if there are no other questions, and we are a little bit running, yes, we are running out of time now, then I would like to thank again Professor Matei for joining us. Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Good afternoon, David. I give the floor to Professor Uitz, please.
We will not have video.
No.
Okay, hi David. My name is Renáta, and I've been requested and actually honored to chair a panel on the role of international organizations for human rights and citizenship education in Europe. I'm from CEU. I teach constitutional law and human rights, and it's my absolute privilege to give the floor to David Mack, who works in the OSCE ODIHR as an advisor. He has a background in minority rights and Roma rights, and also works in promoting and protecting the rights of human rights defenders in Europe. You have 15 to 20 minutes, I was told, and I will show you 5 when you are approaching the 5-minute mark. So the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak. I don't know if I'm going to take 15 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, but I'm really happy also to answer questions from your participants related to the topic. And maybe I should start with just telling you about some of the what we try to focus on when it comes to human rights education here at ODIHR. And I will start with a comment. Unfortunately, human rights education not one of the let's say political priorities for particularly for our participating states. The OSCE is composed of about 57 participating states. It's the entire North. And why do I say this? I have, while working on this subject, we have constant interaction with our participating states, particularly to get support for our programming. And I have to say that donors, so the states that are donors to for our programming, are usually very interested in programs that have quick results, in programs that lead to immediate and visible results. And I think this is an important thing. Human rights education is something that it's long term. We tout, or we do consider it important, and in many of the meetings and discussions and political discussions that we have, everybody says yes, it's important. But then when it comes particularly to support for it, it's not always the case. So this is kind of setting for you a bit the scene for what I'm going to talk about. Our main role at ODIHR is to support the World Program, the UN World Program for Human Rights Education, started in 2005 and it's ongoing. And some of our contributions are done. We work with the Council of Europe, with UNESCO, with the UN, OSCHR, and other entities. We try to pull in resources and work together, or at least to make sure that we have a sort of coordination between the various organizations. And ODIHR is not one of the biggest players exactly because of the elements that I just mentioned regarding to support. So we have, you can always look on our websites. I don't have here with me because I'm home now. I do not have the publications to show them to you. But we have some interesting publications, particularly our guidelines on human rights education for various groups for secondary school teachers and students. We have for police, for health workers, and so on. We also have a compendium of good practices from around the world. This is quite an old publication, but I think it's still very relevant, where we looked at the various methods employed among OSCE participating states to do human rights education. And then one of our recent publications is a human rights education tool, curriculum development tool for human rights education. It has a very long title, which we developed again with Council of Europe, UNESCO, the Organization for American States, and others. And why I mentioned this one, this is the research. I mentioned this one because this publication is essentially a roadmap. I really like it. It was done by Felissa Tibbetts, a consultant, who's a person with quite a lot of experience in the field. And if you have the interest and want to take a look at it, you will see that it's essentially a roadmap. What does a state need to do from a political standpoint, a Ministry of Education, in order to integrate human rights education in the public system? And this, just in a nutshell, the steps are doing legislative review, looking at the legislation, looking at the practices in the country, in schools, imagining new ways of integrating human rights education in the public system, and then finally developing the curriculum, developing tools so that curriculum can be taught, and then training of teachers. And on the basis of these, let's say this roadmap, we drafted a project, a general project, which we put at the, we put out there for our participating states if they need the assistance of ODIHR. This is our main mandate, to assist participating states. We can work with them to go through these spaces. And actually, I just got the news this week that our project, which is based on this on this publication, our project that we are preparing for Belarus has been approved. It took quite a while. It took about 1 year for the Belarus authorities to approve that, and then maybe another year for negotiations with the EU for starting implementation. But what I want to maybe highlight here, we could always have the option of, say, let's do some teacher training, right? Or let's create another tool. And I know that there are many players and NGOs and international organizations doing that. But our, and this is something that I didn't mention and I did push with our senior management. for countries such as Belarus or other countries where we know how the human rights situation is there, I think investing in just, say, teacher training or just developing some tools may often be a waste of money. We've actually done this, but what we see that type of programming is not sustainable. So the conditionality in a way for this project that we're preparing is that it's either we go through the entire through all the paces of reforming the educational system in this sense, and we really extinguish all the paces and try to have this well integrated in the public education system, or frankly we should, at least this is my opinion, maybe then we should not do anything in such places and rather work there where we can. And actually our project is a bit built in that direction. If we see that we do not have the cooperation of the authorities at the incipient stages, at least I advocate for a stop of that program. But let's see. I do not want to start negatively, but I think it's an interesting program, and it's in a way also piloting for us to see whether this is successful, and maybe we can replicate it in other places. Maybe another thing to mention here is my thoughts on the word program, and this is maybe sort of a transition to another activity that we are in preparation or we're working on. The word program, if you have the curiosity to look at the responses of states, of UN member states, to their measurement tool, I think they do this every second year or at the end of every stage. The interest from the states is decreasing. The UN, unfortunately, the colleagues at UN sometimes do not get all the responses that they would need, and I think in general there is a lack of political interest to push forward with the program, and we have experienced this ourselves. The Belarus program actually happened as part of a larger negotiation, what we call the Belarus package, and the human rights education component goes with some other components. So because the political, let's say, it's harder to move bureaucracies and to make say significant inroads for human rights education as part of the public education system, we started thinking, okay, so what are the other options that we have? What can we do? Of course, continue to work with our participating states to propose programs and make available our assistance. But if it's not moving, say countries which are actually okay or are doing okay in this field, they don't need our assistance, right? They have Nordic countries, they have quite good integration of human rights in their schooling. And the ones which would need that are not necessarily always open. So what we thought last year was how can we still do human rights education? And our target, we thought, okay, so the target are school children, students, and to a certain degree also teachers. How could we get to them directly? And what we did is that last year in December, we organized a very interesting meeting in Boston at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And what we did was that we invited software engineers, advertisers, some people from major universities and centers of study such as Stanford and Harvard, and some human rights education experts, and we had a mixed group. And I think that was a very, very interesting experience because it opened our eyes to new venues of work. What would be interesting, and it was very interesting for me to go through that, was that the people we had in the room, they are not necessarily human rights professionals. They are either academics or, as I said, software engineers, advertisers. We even had somebody who was doing neuroscience and psychology. And they deconstructed the entire, like the question to me was, why do you want to do human rights education, and what is human rights education? What do you want to achieve with it? Or, you know, and for the experts, this is kind of, you know, we know what we want to achieve. We want people to know more about human rights and to have the skills maybe to defend human rights and to have attitudes which are consistent with human rights. But in that discussion, we went further than that, or they went further than that, and we started to talk a lot about behavior and influencing behavior, and how can we actually achieve or go towards this idea of influencing human rights consistent behaviors. And all this was against the backdrop last year of a lot of political upheaval. So what we came up in the end, maybe to make a long story short, we came up with some solutions that would apply technology in order to get directly to the to students and pupils. Now we developed a program in partnership with all these experts and partners, and we drafted a program which looks at one, developing a platform, a collaborative online platform, where for one we want to pull in various resources, and we have somebody now working on cataloging all kinds of digital tools, games, videos, whatever digital tools that can be used for doing human rights education in the classroom. So we're going to make a repository of that if you want to catalog. And there's just one side. And then on top of that, we want to make something of a collaborative platform. Actually, this idea came from two students, STEM students two secondary school students from the US who are doing robotics. And they said, well, we collaborate on robotics. Why don't you collaborate, or why don't you think about collaborating on human rights work? So that's one. We also look at assessment module attached to this platform, or as a standalone tool, to which we want to see, are human rights tools effective? Are we getting what we want? I mean, do we just give some information which is stale, abstract, students learn about it, and then they go out and they don't care about it anymore? How can we actually do this work in a way that is effective? And here was a lot of discussions. I'm not an expert, but about behavioralism, about the role of emotions and how emotions inform our decision making and so on. So we want to create, and we will, with some experts on this, to create a tool with which we can assess how effective human rights education curriculums tools actually are. We also want to inspire young people to learn about human rights. So we're thinking about a kind of video campaign in which people create their own. This is a bit in relation with the other portfolio that I work, which is about defending human rights. Like, see, defending human rights is a type of behavior. And we want to inspire young people to maybe take this type of actions. Our concept is human rights defenders are not necessarily those who work in an NGO or journalists or who do this as a profession. Literally anybody who stands up to defend the rights of others is a human rights defender. The main characteristic is the values that they stand and the actions that they take. So this is maybe another component. We have, I think, another interesting component that now doesn't come to mind. But the concept is, let's try to get directly to the students. Students, young people today are a captive audience quite a lot on social media. I do not want to go actually necessarily in a discussion about is this a good thing or not a good thing. The fact it is that young people spend a lot of time on social media. And another thing that we discussed is that technology has the ability to change behaviors pretty quickly. To put it as a professor from Stanford put it in this meeting, you can engender certain behaviors through religion. It takes several generations through laws and other type of reward and punishment system. But lately, technology could create certain types of behaviors in humans in the span of 5 years. So we're also looking at that. And our larger programming, both in human rights education and human rights defenders, are trying to look at the applications of technology, particularly media technology and communication technology in that sense. This is a project that has not yet been commenced. We're talking with our participating states. We are at a very, let's say, at an advanced stage with the project concept. And I hope to be able to start something in this line next year. Okay, I will stop here. I think I talked quite a lot, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you. Questions from right away.
I cannot hear you, sorry.
I'm looking for questions from the room at the moment, so as soon as there is a hand.
Maybe I would like to ask some questions from the room. I see you have participants from, let's say, the younger generation. My question to you would be this: what do you think? Do you think human rights, promoting human rights, or trying to do human rights education through the online medium is something that you see as interesting? Is the premises of our programming something that you see as valid, or maybe we should focus effort somewhere else? Did you hear me?
Yes. So maybe I would ask a question then. You put a lot of emphasis on reaching students directly through online channels. How do you see the role of human rights educators and educators more generally in that? Because we have a room full of people who are committed to bringing human rights in the curriculum, and the tools you were promoting are actually premised on bypassing these people and reaching out to the students directly. So could you tell a little bit about what these people could actually do who
question
form
and
the audience?
That actually brings me again back to, I mentioned, but I did not explain that the tools that we developed, the online tool, important. We hope to have an important role for teachers, for educators. So for one, by trying to bring in, as I said, this repository of tools, I think we're gonna make, a one-stop place where educators can get very easy access to tools that they might want to use in the classroom. And what we're trying to do, what we're going to do is also, we're trying to evaluate them in the beginning, and then we would like to hear back from educators, which ones are really useful for them, are they useful at all, and to do this kind of ranking. We could even rank them and promote them. And another place I mentioned, or the collaborative platform. The idea is, why not say educators, a teacher from Kyrgyzstan, why couldn't a teacher from Kyrgyzstan talk with somebody from Poland or from Hungary or from the United States or Germany on this type of collaborative platform, and share experiences either about tools or approaches that they use in their teaching. And we want to enable, for example, this type of collaboration, of communication, through the application of technology. And we're actually doing this also for the human rights defenders world, where we're also thinking about creating something similar. So it's basically more about creating a community. So again, teachers, to answer your questions, educators will have a space that they can use for both collaborating and also having access to the various tools that are being created. And we really hope that this is going to inspire and also help educators to maybe take a direct. If we wait, say, for all the countries in the OSCE to modify their curriculums and to do those political reforms that are necessary, I think we can wait for a very, very long time. So why not try to already do this, if possible, of course, with applications of technology. I know, does this answer your question?
I hope so. If there are no further questions from the room, then I would really like to thank you for your very insightful comments. And we say bye-bye now, and we turn to the panelists who are in the room. So have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very fruitful and interesting workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, because you will use that. Okay. So, without further ado, I will give you now Dr. Ruxandra Pandea. She is a historian by training, but for many, many years of her career, she worked for the Council of Europe. She's based in Budapest at the Council of Europe's Youth Center, which is a very active organization involving human rights defenders, civil society actors, as well as the broader community. One of her responsibilities is coordinating the implementation of a really interesting instrument in the Council of Europe. It's called the Charter of Education for Democratic Citizenship and Human Rights Education. This is actually the result of a political commitment from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And it has been on since 2000, the resolution is 2010. So we are saying, we can say that the charter is reaching primary school age by now. So let me give you Ruxandra and see what the Council of Europe is doing in this field.
Okay. Now thank you very much for this introduction. I have to say I haven't been called doctor in a long time, so it's very bizarre feeling. I work in non-formal education, but we also cooperate a lot with universities, so we are not strangers. We hear a lot about the speakers, but just and I will not ask you to introduce yourself, I hope I hear from you in the lunch break, but just for a show of hands, how many of you consider themselves human rights activists in this room? Just to get a glimpse of whom we have in the room. All right. And how many consider themselves human rights educators? Okay, and how many would like or are considering to become involved with human rights education? Okay, I get one more, maybe 2 candidates there. All right. And I hope this will also spark some discussions later on. I will not, we are really running out of time because it's a pity. Right, I'm a civil servant for the Council of Europe, and as any civil servant of the Council of Europe, I have the duty to tell you we are not the European Union. And we have far less money. And we do not deal with army cooperation or economic cooperation. It's not fully true, but that's, you know, you can get into the details of that. But we do stand in Europe for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, 47 member states, with the notable exception of Belarus. And actually I'm mentioning here 50 states party to the European Cultural Convention, which is important for the work that we do in the youth sector. I work in the youth sector because that allows us actually to work with the government of Belarus, with the government of Kazakhstan, and sometimes, unsurprisingly, with the government of the Holy See or Vatican. What we do in the Council of Europe, I think we are, most probably all of you know the work that we do around the European Convention on Human Rights and the Court, and that's regularly the most known mechanism, but actually we have quite a comprehensive system of protection of human rights. There are more than 250 treaties in the system of the Council of Europe. Some more or less protected, some more or less dead. So we are focusing on standard setting. We are also looking at monitoring and trying to actually increase our presence in monitoring. But we are also looking at capacity building because human rights cannot be defended by legal means alone. And maybe people who study law might not like me very much, but it is not possible that the courts do the job. And actually, we were making a bet that if people would actually really know their human rights, the courts in the in Europe will be flooded. And we will really have a problem. So we are really looking at building capacity at local and national level. And this comes to build capacity of the legal system, but also to build a culture of human rights, where we have to resort less on the courts, but rather more on the institutions and on the people to actually live in a spirit of human rights. So that's the gist. I'm not entering into what the whole of the Council of Europe is doing. I think this is more for you to get interested. And look, we deal with drugs, and we have a whole agency that looks at ethical issues around drugs in Europe. So there's quite a lot of work to look at. We have this charter. Now, this charter sounds very fancy as a name, Charter for Education, on Education for Democratic Citizenship and Human Rights Education. It was adopted in 2010. It took 20 years to kind of advocate to get these documents going. It is a recommendation of the Committee of Ministers towards member states, which means it's a non-binding document. So it's kind of weak. It's not compared with a convention. So it's kind of weak. But it still holds because all these ministers have, approved it in their session. It holds some sort of political pressure and political commitment and some moral commitment. So it can still be used. What's in the charter? I'll let you read it, not now, later, or I invite you to read it, but a big promise. It says that every person, and I highlight that every person on the territory of the member states of the Council of Europe should have the opportunity to go to education for democratic citizenship or human rights education, shall they want. And it's really every person, and it matters. And then you have a set of principles, standards, actions recommended to member states to implement, from general policy measures, but also measures related with different stages of education, including preschool education and going all the way to higher education, looking at research. And I think essentially it puts quite a lot of emphasis on the cooperation with civil society and especially youth organizations, which are mentioned particularly, and the agency and contribution of young people to delivering human rights education. This we don't get very often in political documents. And what we managed to do, we managed to set up a system of reviewing whether this charter is actually being implemented. And this is quite a success, because for many of these recommendations, sometimes what happens is that they get stuck in a drawer, and somebody remembers and they get nicely quoted, and some governments do things and some governments don't do things. I'm sorry to be cruel, but that's the reality. So we decided that we will review what is being done. We've done 2 exercises, one in 2012 and one in 2016-17, and we plan to keep the exercise regular every 5 years. Now we do it through questionnaires. They're not very nice questionnaires, I confess. One addresses state authorities and usually goes through ministries of education, and one goes through the youth department and addresses civil society, primarily youth organizations, because we are the youth department, but we try to open it up. And the 2 are separate, and then we combine the data. We didn't get much in 2012, and neither did we think that we will get much information in 2012, but we also used it as an educational tool, so that you remind the government, well, you might need to complete this, and well, maybe there is this recommendation, and you should actually do something about it. Okay. I'll get to the results at the end, because I think there are some interesting challenges. I want to explain to you what else we do, so just to have the logic of the work that the Council of Europe does. So this is our, let's say, standard document or our policy document. Youth department is not the only one doing human rights education. So I'll explain first what the other ones do. We have an education department that obviously deals with formal education sector. I think one piece of information is important. They have what they call EDCHRE coordinators. These are people who are educational professionals who are nominated by their government. They are either in ministries or other forms of organization of the government. Sometimes it's an agency or so. And they are supposed to coordinate the way the charter is implemented in the formal education system, and also have some cooperation with civil society. Now, in some countries, they do amazing work. In some countries, they do less work because they have little resources. But this is an interesting network of people that I think it's also available to you if you're interested to take action. One more interesting thing that the department has done is that recently they have adopted, at the level of ministers of education, a reference framework for competencies for democratic culture. This is a set of competencies developed by a group of experts, tested, consulted at European level, and that is now going to be promoted to be implemented in national curricula. And in a way, it's bridging this gap between a policy document like the Charter and how do you actually put this into the curricula and deal with it in various subjects. And once they broke it down to competencies like critical thinking, tolerance of ambiguity, solidarity and so on, then it also becomes a little bit easier to see how you can cover them through different subjects. So that is also an interesting document. We have a children's rights division, so if they are focusing quite a lot on children participation, on questions of violence and sexual abuse, on digital skills and participation of children in decision-making regarding human rights online. I think they are, if you plan to work with children, they have particularly cool resources on addressing human rights issues with children directly. For those of you who are more into legal studies or would like to develop more legal knowledge, we have a program that goes online. It's called HELP, Human Rights Education for Legal Professionals. It's really a lot of online courses, primarily targeted at judges, lawyers, and to support them to implement, to take forward the decisions of the court and the jurisprudence of the court in the national system, but many of them are actually open for everyone. And the latest one, for example, is that they launched on 25th of November, is on gender-based violence and domestic violence. And it's quite an interesting course to take if you have some time. It's self-paced, and some of them are also translated. Now, the Human Rights Commissioner also has, in connection with the national human rights institutions, because he supports and coordinates the network, they are also having a role in human rights education. The work there is less visible because obviously usually the commissioner speaks on topics that are uncomfortable for various ministers and so on. His role is also, his or their role is to actually bring these topics to the table. So the work on human rights education tends to phase out or not be so much into the media attention. This is all what other people do. Are you still alive? Yes? Okay, we're not gonna test this. Okay, now what do we do in the youth department? We have a human rights education youth program that surprisingly started before the charter existed, with aims that have changed over time, but mainly looking nowadays at the implementation of the charter, particularly in the youth sector, at developing the quality of human rights education with young people and by young people, supporting cooperation between formal and non-formal sectors, and I would say we try to put quite some emphasis on recognition of the work done in non-formal education and of the skills acquired or the competences acquired by learners in non-formal education, because this usually it's not always so recognized and valued in various systems. And we're still trying, well, I think we are quite successful, but there's still an effort to mainstream and secure mainstreaming of human rights education in youth policy and youth work. We have a tool to defend your human rights. You can use it creatively. This is the light version. The full version would have 100 pages more, so you can literally defend your human rights if you need, in multiple ways. This is Compass. We focus on non-formal education, obviously, and we try to create resources that in a way are self-sufficient. And you have several of our manuals with the idea of giving an introduction, offering educational activities that educators can take and adapt, but actually also run in various settings, and offering background information on human rights related themes. So it is not the ultimate information, rather is, I would say, if you have to run a session on migration with a group of young people because they're interested, what we have there as information is a starting point. Now, we also invest quite a lot in translation of the manual, and I'm happy to say that, and we also revised the manual. The last revision was in 2012, and currently the manual has been translated in more than 40 languages, so it's quite a bestseller of the Council of Europe. And I'm happy to say that we offer very limited support for translation, so it's been a lot of NGOs and a lot of human rights institutions that have decided that the manual is valuable, and they actually did the most of the fundraising for translation. In some countries, we reached the level that the manual was used in civic education or similar topics in formal education. In some countries, we've also reached a level where it has been banned and repudiated as the number one, Okay. Now, then the program is quite comprehensive. We try to work directly with young people, but we actually discovered this is not quite sustainable, so we work primarily with multipliers. Because right now we have 2 European Youth Centers. One is actually here in Budapest, so maybe take some time to visit the European Youth Center. It's up on the hill on Rojandom. Besides a review of the charter with NGOs, besides creating materials that are accessible, we run a regular training for trainers in human rights education. This is quite a long-term training course because it has 6 months online where we put quite some emphasis on learning human rights, but also skills of doing non-formal education. We do study sessions. This is a hilarious name, remaining from the 70s in youth work, because these are actually international activities done with international youth networks. And Hirsi had used to hold some, in the past, used to hold activities with us in EYCP. This is something that you can consider, for example, to apply for as a follow-up of this. We do bring people together for forums, for seminars, for learning from each other. Maybe, at least those who are more like human rights activists and who might want to start, we support national training courses in human rights education at national level, because not everybody speaks English, French, potentially Russian and Arabic, what we would regularly use, but rather most human rights educators would work in local languages. So I think it's really important to make it available. We do offer financial, very limited, but yet still some financial support for these courses to happen. We offer institutional support, so we also fundraise together with NGOs. And we do offer educational support, so there could be an educational advisor or a trainer who could come and work with your team to actually run this training course. And we have a European Youth Foundation that actually supports only youth organizations, one of the last bastions, where you don't have to compete with a company or with a fully blown big organization. And they support local human rights education projects, generally funded up to 10,000, but this we are talking also about, neighborhood projects, so it can also be quite generous for those of you who would like to have an initiative. It could be a human rights initiative or a human rights education initiative. If you're curious about all these programs, I will send also to colleagues also the links so you can also see. We have a deadline open for the national training courses. Okay. In 2017, we published this beautiful report. It's a little bit bigger than this, which is called the Report on the State of Human Rights Education and Citizenship. And it's the result of the review of the charter implementation, but also the result of discussions in various forums that we had over the last 2 years. Too interesting, just to bring in some of the conclusions. I agree with what David said before. In a way, there is actually a lot of presence of, especially education, citizenship education in international documents. And it's particularly linked in the last 2 years with terrorist attacks. And it's been called at EU level, at Council of Europe level, as investing in citizenship education to be the countermeasure to the terror that we are subjected to. This is, in a way, it is good that a lot of attention is given finally to citizenship and human rights education, but the link sometimes can be very problematic. And I think this is something that we need to tread carefully as human rights educators or as policymakers. And there have been several, declarations that when you read them, you think, oh gosh, from tomorrow we're going to have, massification. We're going to have mass classes of human rights education. It's going to be massive. But yet, when we look at the implementation of these measures, going down at state level and even further down at school level and so on, we see a different reality. The more that this is called, the more funds are cut for education. So it's a little curious situation where education is called to respond to the challenges of society, but yet we cut the means of education. So, the report also showed that there are little European-wide, little provisions and little activity in vocational, little human rights education, vocational education and training. That funding is severely going down. That, as opposed to 2012, and it should not come as a surprise in a way, governments report decreased level of cooperation with civil society. Interesting enough, and decreased support for civil society, although they report quite an increase of activity of their own. Interesting enough, NGOs know the charter and use the charter, but 80% of the young people that they work with do not know about the charter. It's a question mark whether young people should really know, but if we think about the role of students, this could be a nice advocacy document, so maybe they should know. Now, we've also done, this is actually not from the report, this is from an evaluation of the program, but I think it's quite symptomatic. And this we didn't face in 2012. 42% of the people who have been somehow involved in the last 7 years in the Council of Europe youth program on human rights education say that they recently faced political resistance when doing human rights education or addressing human rights issues. That activists and educators that were not necessarily targets have become targets nowadays and are labeled as subversive, as whatever not. That exceptional measures that are being taken by various governments in the name of security and also emergency states that we are experiencing now for a long time interfere with their capacity to do their work. That public, they say it's around 40%. So that it also matches in a way the government. There's little cooperation or public authorities are actually hindering. And NGOs also say they have fairly little capacity to do advocacy for human rights education because they are in a thirst for resources, which also means that they are rather competing with each other than being able to build sustainability. And there are some NGOs who have little incentive because the political environment in which they operate makes advocacy measures for human rights education less likely to succeed, so it's not exactly what they should do. And I want to say that I agree there is a pressure at institutional level, at national level, to deliver quick results. I have also heard and in various discussions, well, the charter, now we'll see 5 years after, the charter, we'll see if it works or if it doesn't work. So if it doesn't work now after 7 years, well, maybe it's time to drop it, which is not the way we actually deal with this kind of documents. I stop here, leaving you with these questions, and I don't know if you have questions yourselves.
Thank you, Ruxandra. We will now go to Robert Sata, whose background is in political science. He has been around CEU for a long time, so he's seen the good and the bad and whatever was in between. His academic interests are in minority rights and rights of ethnic minorities and Roma rights. I think he knows a lot more about PhD education than most of us would ever wish. And so without further ado, Professor Sata, and then we will go to questions.
Thank you, Renáta, for this very kind introduction. And I actually know I am in between your lunch break, so I have good news and bad news. So the good news is I have not prepared the talk because I just stepped in and I was told that we will have a Q&A. So this is going to be very short, but hopefully the not so bad news is it might be not very new for you. But I was actually thinking of the idea of what the international organizations such as the Council, the EU or the UN could be doing to have the standards of human rights education and citizenship education, basically. And these are, I think, serious issues, especially today. And I'll turn back to my background in political science, right? So today we see the politics of fear pretty much everywhere. And politics of fear don't necessarily go very well together with human rights, protection, education, or even, let's put it simply, an interest in human rights, because fear is a primordial concern, I think, for the governments. And at the same time, this is a huge literature in political science, but there's an ongoing problem, right, with the democratic deficit, voters' apathy, people not be exercising their citizenship rights, not being participants in the political game. How could we eventually get, better government, better public policies? And I think this is, again, very much a question of education. And I'm not, an expert on different educational policies, although I do teach from time to time, but I guess you always teach something you don't know, right? So I believe actually that international organizations should take the first step actually to keep pushing for these standards. And as Renáta said, I've been more familiar with how the standards and norms of minority rights protections have been expanded. And I really think that there needs to be more to be done on the standards of human rights education, on the practices of how you can, teach people to exercise their citizenship rights. And I'm very much thankful for Anca-Ruxandra's presentation. Actually fits perfectly to me, right? So you have several different organizations all trying to do different things, some very similar, some very different. But what I see the real problem, and I looked at this quickly, right, so I don't exactly look totally lost in space. People never really get to know what these international organizations do. Eventually, it is only maybe the experts that will read these reports. The monitoring, as we know, is done with more or less interest from the public side. Even these days, as I understand, even the NGO or the civic partners have difficulties in monitoring this thing. But I really believe that it should be these international organizations that, should somehow surpass the national government, surpass the civic sphere, because I do believe this is not a question for the civic or the non-governmental sphere. This is a matter, as we heard earlier, of public goods, so to say. This is part of what democracy should be about. Right? So I do believe there should be more united effort, which of course I do understand that the political will is not really there. But I have much higher hopes actually for the international organizations being able to actually push forward the standards, the norms, the values, most likely even the best practices that eventually could, I think, bring some change. I'm not sure whether this will be incremental change, but I do believe this would be the way forward to achieve change. I also always tell my students that, practice makes the master. So I do believe that the international organizations would eventually have to step up, so to say, their game in controlling their member governments and others who are non-members as well. But in today's post-truth world, actually, I would see a very active role for these organizations to always step out and say, no, this is a violation of this and this right. No, this is actually not how you exercise citizenship rights, or clamping down on demonstrators here and there and actually violate, standards of good citizenship that we have been upholding for years and years. And so I also believe this would eventually help those that are in the field of educating about human rights and citizenship practices, because, as I said, it's always easier if you have, an example in front of you, and eventually you can take your group of kids or adults or whoever out for a demonstration, or you can write together a petition, and these kind of things. So, as I said, I don't want to keep you from lunch, so I'll stop here with this very superficial thoughts on how international organizations could do a bit more in this field. And eventually, if you have maybe some questions and comments, I'm very sure that everybody will be happy to answer these.
Thank you very much. I mean, it was very interesting to listen to the panel because so three bags of thoughts and maybe it completes the picture a little bit. Especially when you look at ODIHR, which is the OSCE, which is a large international organization, and it usually prides itself as being the only one which stretches from Vancouver to Vladivostok, but also includes some non-democracies. So when in an organization like that, human rights education is on the table, then very often you see that human rights education is many things to many people. So you can advance the right to a clean environment or health or free public primary education according to a government mandated curriculum, or women's rights, which are social goods and sound good in a welfare state, by clamp down on freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of association, or religious freedom. So on the one hand, one important lesson is to remember that when we talk about human rights education, we do not necessarily talk about education, about citizenship in terms of citizenship in a liberal democracy, where you have political competition and an open public space to discuss ideas, and especially to criticize the government in order to improve the living conditions of those people who are the most vulnerable. Now, the second lesson, and that was very interesting from Ruxandra's presentation, I would really like to highlight that human rights is becoming increasingly less and less popular with governments, even in countries which are at least in principle committed to democracy and the rule of law. Because the Council of Europe, while this is a bigger, this is a large club, it's a smaller club than the OSCE, and those member states which are in the Council of Europe signed commitments to promote human rights and the rule of law. Now, the problem is that human rights defenders in the Council of Europe usually stand up for troublemakers. They stand up for people who say nasty things in the newspapers, people who stage demonstrations. And you can laugh at, for one of my favorite human rights questions is, which students laugh at in a class on political rights, whether one person can exercise freedom of assembly. Is there such a thing as a one-person picket? Except that when you go to Russia, and this is what you are left with on account of freedom of assembly, this is one of the most vital questions you can ask, and this is a question about the scope of fundamental rights. Similarly, human rights protect those who are different, and they do protect the underdog. You can say that prisoners' voting rights is absolutely a marginal issue, and we should care about better hospitals and heating in public schools. However, when a state decides to limit the right to vote, then that tells much more about the state of democracy in a member state than very often the amount of money they spend on environment protection campaigns. And going back also to what Provost Matei was saying, academic freedom and especially university autonomy might be a fluid concept. However, states which do interfere with university autonomy do not think too much about a functioning democracy. Now, this brings me back to the importance of that last slide in Ruxandra's presentation about how human rights defenders who also do advocacy work see a lot more hostility towards their work than before. It's extremely important to keep in mind that, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, most of the NGOs who are involved with human rights advocacy and human rights education are the very same NGOs which participate in regional and international reporting and monitoring mechanisms within the EU and also within the Council of Europe. These reporting mechanisms usually highlight state failures in defending human rights, And when you come to the Council of Europe, especially, many important human rights issues are highlighted by NGOs which sue the government. Every single time these NGOs win a case, the government is in a hot seat. It's uncomfortable, and instead of living up to, yeah, actually we signed up to an obligation and we didn't quite deliver on this. Instead of doing this kind of work, the easy response is lashing out at the NGOs who were unpatriotic to begin with when they started to air their dirty laundry on the regional level. So before, I know that we really are going to lunch very quickly, but I would really like to highlight some of the key points which can explain or which contribute to an explanation on why human rights education and the involvement of civil society organizations is much more than some sort of shiny little afternoon conversation which we can then tick and go home, because ultimately everyone who is committed to this project, whenever you put your hands up, you are talking about how constitutions and democracies work. And even if you are not liked for this, that's probably the most important work that is left to do, whether you do it in cooperation with each other or in cooperation with regional organizations. Now, having said that, questions and comments before lunch, and please just talk to Anca-Ruxandra and Robert, who did a fantastic job. Yeah.
I would like to be a little bit provocative here. I'm addressing this common question to all of you, and I'm just wondering about, because you have mentioned the disenchantment and even hostility of governance vis-a-vis international organizations' work in these areas, and doesn't it seems to me that you're portraying it a little bit as something, as an external factor, that the international organizations themselves have been doing a steady work and then along the same principles, and then but unfortunately the governments, they don't want to accept it anymore. And I'm just wondering, based on a little bit of my own experience as well, whether the internal structure or the working methods of some of these organizations, which, especially UN, OSCE, or which reflect or preserve outdated and historically outdated patterns. For instance, what I'm referring to is I'm more familiar with the UNESCO's working methods, and they still have the country groups in UNESCO and also in the UN grouped by the so-called Old World Order. So before the transition, and there has been a lot of other issues at UNESCO, as you probably know, about withdrawal of the US and Canada, withdrawal of funding and membership, and different other ethical aspects, such as countries, dictatorships financing large educational projects. At the same time, they are oppressing their own citizens, but that we should accept the money that's going for education. So what I'm saying is that what I'm asking is, to what extent has there been a reflection on internally within these organizations to assess whether these outdated and very much politically determined organizational setups are actually hindering the legitimacy of these work of these institutions?
I mean, they are looking at me most likely because I'm the political scientist. Of course, these organizations work in their specific ways, which are not necessarily the most conducive to promoting human rights or any kind of commitment, actually, on parts of different governments. But this is what I meant, that eventually there are these theories that private institutions develop their own identities and norms and values as well. And I would really rather wish that we've seen a stronger role of these institutions to push forward on these norms and values. Of course, this does not mean that we will not have, difficulties because we are living in a political world and everything is always a question of political will. But I think monitoring capacities and acceptance that you are actually monitored and you know that you eventually are taken to court for failing on obligations that you subscribe to should be part of normal political life. And this is what I think is the problematic, right? That in some parts of the world, and unfortunately more and more parts of the world, this is actually taken very anonymously on by the different governments.
So this is about the legitimacy of the very institutions who are monitoring, so the guardians of the guardians, right? So this is kind of a dilemma within, in the sense that it's the governments or the members, the members, states of these organizations who are deliberately upholding structures which make these organizations lose grounding and legitimacy within their own countries. So this is the kind of paradox here.
It's the beauty and the nightmare, no? Which is at the core of human rights, in the way where, the state is the protector, but the state is the violator, and it's at the core of the setup of these institutions. So instead of, solving the dilemma in a, I would say, maybe autocratic way, where you say, okay, this is the on top of this, the Council of Europe eventually is the sum of its member states. And that means that it goes through political dialogue and pressure, and that sometimes is particularly painful. And let's be frank. In the youth sector, we're a bit more lucky than other sectors because we actually have a system of co-management. So we have governments, we have one body where the governments are represented and one body where the NGOs are represented, and we have co-decision. So they have to do everything by consensus. So we are a little bit more advanced. Now, I don't want to imply, I know that in the presentation it almost sounded like this, that, we've done our work and, sorry, when it goes to national level, something doesn't work. I think, I'm not joking when I'm saying that the Council of Europe is not a rich organization and is not a European Union. Because I do think that when we're looking at impact and the quick results that are expected, we need to look at the quantity of human rights education programs that are being implemented, delivered, supported, whatever you want, at national and local level. And we have to look secondly for the quality of them. In the youth sector, and I have this main experience of working in the youth sector, many youth NGOs, we are not talking about the main human rights NGOs here, who maybe are a bit more stable, a bit more recognized. We are talking about small youth groups, initiative groups, and it's exactly those civil society initiatives that should be supported to boom because they keep democracy alive. Most of them, they do volunteer work. Most of them have very few resources. When we give these 6-7 national training courses, sometimes there are countries where this is the program through which you can actually do a national training course in human rights education. So I think we have, and many times we are being asked, do you have proof that it works? Yes, we have proof that it works, but it also requires, it requires more investment than this. I am not saying that we don't see results, but I think we do have a lack of capacity. So I'm taking from the table the cases where there is really political antagonism, where there is a criticism of human rights. And I'm looking also at the work that we do sometimes with civil servants. Sometimes there's genuine lack of competence, and it's not necessarily a lack of willingness in the government on how to deal with this document, or what to actually do, or how not to overload the curricula. And I think these are valid questions. But in a way, it's always a dilemma, and I'm not sure I know the answer. When and should an international organization come and do the job of the state? Or should what we try to do is not necessarily always functional? should we actually create pressure from international level, but also from grassroots level, to bring about change? Because I think it's not wise either that NGOs start to provide what the state should provide, neither should the international organizations do, because it's not feasible somehow.
And also, if I may just add, I mean, there might be deficiencies at the institutional level, but usually then there are also shadow reports put on any official report by nowadays. And what I meant is that, you know, I understand this is utopic, but it would be actually lovely to see institutional development within these international organizations. And, you know, I could imagine more high commissioners or ombudsmen on different issues, starting from youth education down, you know, actually practicing citizenship rights. And that's what I meant. That I do believe that by promoting the standards and values, you might eventually escape this vicious circle of governmental, it's not control, but it's always an agreement of the entire club, right?
Yeah, but I mean, I think it was David who said earlier before that, what was it, that if a government does not agree to the big educational reform, then we don't go in that state. And I think that's kind of wrong approach in a way sometimes. I mean, I can see the point. I don't want to over-criticize. I can see the point that if there is no willingness at state level, then yeah, most probably you cannot generate a big reform. But also I think sometimes supporting civil society groups that are willing to do this work is also bringing change. Maybe not with I mean, at the end of the day, let's also be honest, massive educational reforms actually also take a lot of time, so you can also still support people there, not necessarily the government if the government is not willing. But I think it's a very different reality for OSCE, and I think he's referring to states that are slightly more complicated than
I guess you have you want to keep two things in and that's the law professor in me. So you always look at regional and international human rights standards as minimum standards. And when we are talking about governments violating a standard, they are violating what we regard to be a minimum. And when we are doing monitoring and reporting, then we are saying that they didn't do the bare minimum. Now, ultimately, when you do human rights education, your job is not to reinforce the minimum, but to actually show what's beyond that. And it's extremely difficult to do that with path-dependent organizations that are currently struggling to reinforce a minimum standard. And governments, of course, who do more will say that, well, they are actually going further, so why on earth would we want to be in the same club as Kazakhstan? Now, there is one point which is in the title of the panel, and I think it's also very much worth reflecting on, because we did not talk about one particular group which is especially vulnerable. There is citizenship and human rights on the slide, and you have by now hundreds of thousands of children who are not citizens and who do have human rights. These are refugee children. And many of them are not based in, are not in Europe, but when it comes to access to education on primary, secondary and university level, then a very important piece of the cake is missing if you do not look at these children who are not citizens of the country where they are residing. So concepts of citizenship will not help them. And when you come to international organizations, they actually easily fall into a clash of competing organizations because it's UNHCR that is the refugee network that is meant to take care of them, except that they will take care of shelter, food and water, and not of primary education. And if you do not do your primary education, and you don't have documents of having done your primary education, the chances that you will get secondary or even university level education are extremely small. So that's something to plant a bug in your ears in terms of when next steps might be going beyond the minimum. Kamen Petrus from Slovakia.
Thank you very much. So and I would like to react to the title of the panel. Yeah? What can international organizations, a body, do to improve standards of education for human rights? I think that what they can do, two principal things: to build more synergies between themselves, between each other, and to eliminate unfair competition. Okay, because now we have the OSCE, then you have the HCN and OSCE and the Office for the Freedom of Press, then you have UN, you have UNESCO, and the OHCHR in Geneva, and then you have other UN bodies, then you have Council of Europe, whatever, and one thing is the political will. There is no political will in the States that we have identified yesterday. We spoke about the absence of political will. But on the other hand, there is also a limited administrative capacity to cope with all of that administrative burden and reporting burden that all these various bodies and international organizations are placing on the states. And believe me that all this administrative burden is in most of our states, is on the shoulders of very few people. The same people are writing the reports to the Council of Europe, to the UN, to the UNESCO, and to the OSCE, and whatever. So what are they doing? They're doing the alibist work. Okay, they just write absolutely formal alibistic report and send it to you. And what's the outcome of it? Nothing. So you know nothing about the real state. You just know a formal answer of a bureaucrat sitting in one of the ministries. Okay, so I think that this is the first thing that the international organization should do, to build more synergies. And what David what he referred to, it is a very good initiative. It is guidelines on human rights education for secondary schools, which was developed in cooperation with all these bodies. Am I right? So it was not just the OSCE or their initiative, but also UN and Council of Europe was involved. So it's a very good initiative. So I think that this is what the international organizations should do. Of course, the UN has started something. So they in their reporting terms that they developed this concept of core documents. So you don't have to report to each of these 6 or 7 treaty bodies the same documents. So you can form this core body and then to report just the specificities to the treaty bodies. So, but that's just the beginning. So you cannot simply place so much administrative burden on the states, because then they cannot cope with that.
And also a comment, it might sound a little bit like a regional frustration, but it's not, I can assure you for that. And I understand this part of rigidity that some international organizations have. And for example, in Romania, there is this network of organizations, OECD and UNESCO, and they try to train civil servants into changing curricula or adapting the educational system. And they invite for almost 20 years the same person over and over again. So basically, when you see that you have no change in 3 or 4 or 5 years, then maybe you should invite other people. Or maybe you should try to expand your network and try to bring experts together. So in this sense, I understand. It's sort of pointless to say that international organizations should put more pressure into national governments when the national organizations work with the same people from government. So maybe they should expand their reach and bring together more people and basically send their message to a broader, let's say, or a larger area of experts, civil servants, decision makers. So it's also part of this rigidity that you were talking about. I'm not sure I agree that we work with the same ones. I think you have overlaps, but I think that David is also a little bit in the details. I know of this kind of cases also in Romania and in other countries where you have the same network doing the same thing, or the same person going to the same courses, and I think this is something that one needs to at one point evaluate what's the point of that. But I would not want to judge and say everybody is the same and all the reports are copied, because in all honesty there is an international contact group on human rights education. I'm talking really only on human rights education now, where we try to coordinate a bit. So for example, the report of the Council of Europe counts as the report on EDC and HRE for the Sustainable Development Goals. So, and this is the regional mechanism. So in a way it feeds into that, so we don't duplicate. It does not eliminate duplication at so many other levels. I agree. And for example, many people who come on youth policy issues to us, they go to the European Union. Sometimes it's actually quite good. It's the same people, so we can coordinate there. So sometimes it's not so good. So because then it would be the same people implementing in the country, so that they can see how they can, work better with the organizations. It's tricky. But I also think that it's also about sometimes civil society also pointing out that this person, well, look, it's the same organization, or also we would like to be in there. Because or experts also joining. There are also calls for experts, so I think we all need to make this effort to come a bit closer to each other sometimes.
And I think it's the issues about this fragmentation that often, there are overlaps, but at the same time, I think there's also competition, both between the international organizations and, of course, on the domestic level as well. Because if the Council seeks out one organization, but the EU goes to another organization, then they write up different things, and in the end, they end up showing the fingers to each other rather than doing any policy development. But at the same time, the problem is that each of these organizations belongs to a club, and the membership sometimes changes quite drastically. You can go from the bigger to the smaller clubs. And this is again why I do have this dream that actually there will be, more substantial treaties. It becomes a primary goal for a number of organizations, and then you can actually cut down on this stuff, the duplication, the fragmentation, and somehow channel energies together.
Just a short question. Thank you very much for the presentation. Yesterday, in the decision-making panel and the NGO panel, and from the student side, it came out always the same question, that in many of our countries, in Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Romania, and Hungary, there is a huge gap between the education in the countryside and in the bigger cities. Some of us received our primary education in smaller cities or villages. And how do you implement or support human rights and citizenship education in those remote areas where international organizations do not have satellite offices, do not have headquarters, do not have sometimes even NGO partners who work there? So how do you try to aid states to implement?
And where even teachers are computer
illiterate, you don't have online facilities. Yeah.
We are talking about ground empires as Hungary, Slovakia, or the Czech Republic, where you have to travel a week in order to reach one end from the other. And I think that's a very, very, very relevant question.
I would like to point out that there are very big differences in quality of education within the city margins as well. Just not to forget that kind of difference, which is also very strong. I also get another question quite often: how do you reach out unorganized youth? Which is a little bit also like, how do we work with the unorganized youth as an international organization, which is a bit of a tricky question, because it's very hard for an international organization to work with the unorganized youth, except by random chance. I am not claiming that we are reaching out to every remote area. I think if we would have done it, you would have seen the results of that. There are several actually networks. There is the Rural Youth Europe and several other networks of young people, farmers as well, who self-organize and who work quite interestingly. and we are supporting them for quite some time now. We put a lot of focus on access to social rights in our last 7 years, and we were looking at access to social rights primarily of young people who experience disadvantage, so come from either remote areas or from disadvantaged neighborhoods. And there we have developed quite some practice about on self-organization, but it's also beyond our mandate to deal with questions of, let's say, infrastructure development, beyond the mandate of the youth department in a sense. But we have learned, for example, we have developed quite some interesting work with few good shining practices. I'm not saying many shining practices on access to social rights, because primarily access to social rights is dependent on local authorities. So there we have seen, talking about fragmentation, there is also this tendency, if you come from youth work or youth organizations, that you try to provide all the services that in a way are missing. So it's a bit of a humanitarian approach, but it's not within the mandate of youth workers. So there we have developed quite some good examples of how you can cooperate with a municipality to develop both policy and programs. And there is another program which is particularly focused on Roma in the Council of Europe. We have a special Roma team. It's called Romac, I think still called Romac. And there they are working with mediators at community level, so involving also the Roma community in policy making. And there are a few interesting examples of how you can do it. It's not, I'm not claiming major results, but I think there are some good practices on which we can build.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then I would like to thank the panelists. It was really exciting, and thank you for all the questions and comments. And I'm assuming lunch is outside, but Anta, so lunch is outside.
It's outside,
okay.
like yesterday.
Yeah. Thank